Shaky truce in eastern Ukraine is once again put at risk following assassination of Russian commander Arseny Pavlov. Ukrainian side denies any involvement, but Russians accused Ukrainian special services and called the attack tantamount to a declaration of war by Kiev. So far, fighting concentrated in Mariupol direction.
Militants were trying to advance an attack, but they were stopped by dense fire near Fodina settlement. They asked at once for artillery support, and the enemy showered our positions with artillery and mortar shells for almost 11 hours.
The clashes are taking place amid a seeming deadlock in the Minsk peace process. Kiev insists that constitutional changes granting autonomy to Donbass and local elections can take place only after heavy weapons are withdrawn from the conflict zone, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, assumes control over Ukraine-Russia border. Meanwhile, Moscow and Russians accuse Kiev of sabotaging its political commitments on the Minsk deal and urge it to take political steps in tandem with demilitarization. Some experts believe the standoff may result in a frozen conflict.
Putin is the only side who wants to speed up the processes of resolving East Ukraine crisis, as the fast solution would benefit him.
The two-year conflict in eastern Ukraine has claimed lives of 9,600 people and wounded 22,000 others. Leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany and France agreed to meet in Berlin on October 19 to discuss the worsening security situation in the eastern Ukraine. As the four leaders are to sit at the same table for the first time over the past year, Kiev urges not to expect much from the talks. Len Savchuk, Press TV, Kiev.
Joining us now to discuss this further via Skype is Stephen Kelly. He's a former NSA contractor. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Kelly. Now, I'd like to get your assessment as far as the comments made by Mr. Jafari goes, where he says that the campaign to liberate Mosul is helping defend the world against Daesh.
I think that's very fair, and I think that the fighters of Iraq should be commended for the excellent work they've done, especially with their campaign to liberate Mosul. Oh, God, unbelievable. I'm sorry, but there. I think that they're doing a great job, and I think that what he says is very accurate, because it's true that there are fighters from all over the world that are campaigning there, and I think that that eliminating Mosul as a territory that they can use as establishing a base is going to do a lot of work for making sure that ISIL is obliterated and never becomes stationary.
All right, but Mr. Kelly, of course, there is that question of the way the mainstream media is also looking at what comes after the liberation of Mosul, or even during the liberation of Mosul, where they're talking about sectarianism and they're talking about human rights violations, etc. What do you make of that?
Obviously, the West is going to constantly suggest that there's going to be some issues between the Shiites and the Sunnis and the various people who are involved. Certainly, the Kurds being involved, I see this as probably the biggest issue. My biggest concern, of course, is that the Americans are somehow involved in the liberation of Mosul. I would be very concerned about that. And the second of all, they seem to be allowing the retreat and the fleeing of the forces, the ISIS forces, which will probably regroup in Syria or someplace else. And I should think that more effort should be made to make sure that they are not able to escape.
And before I let you go, of course, there is that question of how of the Turkish presence on Iraqi soil. It is obviously going to complicate the issue, where we have the Turkish president speaking of how Turkey needs to be part of what happens once Mosul is liberated, and to decide what happens as far as the bringing back of stability to Mosul goes. How do you see that further complicating the issue?
Obviously, that's going to be a complication. I don't think Turkey has anything to say about what happens there. I personally think that the Kurdish issue is something that's is a complication that's going to be remain, but I don't see that as a Turkish issue. I think that Turkey needs to stay out of the affairs of Iraq as the same as it needs to stay out of the affairs of Syria. So that's really an important part of that.
All right, let's leave it there for now. That's Stephen Kelly, former NSA contractor, joining us via Skype from Los Angeles. Mr. Kelly, it's always great having you with us.
Publisher and editor of Politics First, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, joins us now from the British capital, London. Sir, welcome to the program. Let's start off with getting your outlook on the Mosul offensive and how you see events transpiring in the northern Iraqi city.
Well, I think that the battle for Mosul, now it has commenced, could be a turning point in the conflict in Iraq, much the same as the battle for Aleppo could be a turning point in the conflict in Syria. And I think that the fact that ISIS is now using civilians in Mosul as human shields demonstrates once again the depraved nature of ISIS, the wicked, repugnant nature of ISIS fighters who subscribe to a wicked, odious ideology. And it is very important for people to remember that there is no difference between the campaign to liberate Mosul to the campaign to liberate Aleppo. Aleppo and Mosul are controlled by Islamist terrorists, and there is really no difference between ISIS, between al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army. They are all extremists and they are all Islamist terrorists. And I think if we go back to Mosul, it is very important that the Iraqi army is not impinged in its attempt to liberate Mosul. And of course, I am referring to blatant interference in the Iraqi government's campaign to liberate Mosul, interference on behalf of Turkey and on behalf of Saudi Arabia.
Well, people are fleeing Mosul as the offensive is taking place there, but also Daesh Takfiri terrorists are reported to be fleeing the city. That also has caused a lot of stir over the past few days to the fact that the ISIL terrorists will be scattering to adjacent areas and close by areas, even some bringing up the specter of many of these Daesh terrorists returning to Europe. What are your thoughts on the issue?
My initial thought would be that perhaps those ISIS fighters should return to the country where they came from, Turkey, to the country where they were trained and where they were equipped, Turkey. But I think that the reality is that many of these ISIS fighters in Mosul, if they are able to retreat from Mosul, then I suspect the bulk of them will try to get into Syria. And it will therefore be very, very important for the Syrian military, supported by the Russian military, to neutralize any group of ISIS fighters who do enter Syria, because there are simply tens of thousands of ISIS fighters in Syria at the moment. And the Syrian army is on the offensive in Syria. It is liberating lots and lots of Syrian territory. And what the Syrian army does not want is thousands more ISIS fighters coming into Syria. So ideally, the Iraqi military and its supporting forces will be able to encircle Mosul and prevent any ISIS fighters from getting out. However, it seems at the moment that Mosul is not encircled by the Iraqi military. That, of course, could change. But if it isn't encircled, then, of course, there is a very, very distinct possibility that ISIS fighters could go into Syria, and they will simply regroup in Syria and attack the Syrian army, which, of course, is not what the Syrian army wants, and is not what anyone who is opposed to ISIS and Islamist terrorism in the world wants to see.
publisher and editor of Politics First, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, joining us from London. Thank you, sir.
Around about 10 in the morning today, we received a statement from the military media spokesperson saying that there was this cross-border firing last night around 2 a.m., which lasted till 8 a.m. in the morning. So it was for 6 hours that there was cross-border firing, and Pakistan responded to it. The Indians started it, as they always claim here in Pakistan, that the Indians started it, and called it unprovoked firing from the border. And then the Pakistanis responded, and then 2 soldiers were killed because of that. While we were covering this news in the morning, at the same time, news from India started coming in which the DGMO there had said that there was a surgical strike. After which we tried to contact the military here, and the military has been saying that it has refuted this claim. We talked to the Defense Ministry, they've refuted this claim, and they're saying that this is completely baseless, and Pakistan would have responded equally in a similar manner if there was any surgical strike. So for the last few hours, we've been seeing that what is being reported in Pakistan and what is being reported across the border are 2 completely different stories.